Hey guys, thanks for joining me in another video. Today we're going through paper 4, the first variant of it, for May, June 2018. So without further ado, let's begin. I would strongly encourage you guys to have a read through the paper first so that you have an understanding of what each of the questions are about, because I'm mainly going to be focusing on the answers and how to derive the answers. So it would be nice if you guys had a read through and actually knew what the questions were about first. That would make things a whole lot easier for you as well, and we can save some time. So the first question here is just purely about enzymes. Very simple, just getting you to label each of these here. A is of course the substrate, which enters the active site which has a complementary shape to the substrate, and when they combine you get the enzyme substrate complex, which eventually forms the products D from the substrate. Okay, so moving on. In terms of chemical digestion, it's the idea that products, the production of smaller soluble molecules from larger insoluble molecules. And this is really important for our bodies because then the small molecules can be absorbed through intestine walls and into the blood, where it can make its way to the rest of the body and used as nutrients. So these are different parts of the alimentary canal. You should know the structures already, but we will briefly go through it. This is M is the salivary glands that give the mouth A saliva, going down B the esophagus, entering C, which is the stomach, acidic conditions in there, and going down to J and E, which is the ileum and the duodenum, which makes up the small intestine, moving on to H, which is the large intestine, and F and G. They've already labeled F for you, which is the rectum. So yeah, we've got the anus, which is G. So you are required to fill in this table here. So site of starch digestion would be in the mouth because amylase is contained in the saliva, which breaks down starch. Reabsorption of water happening mainly in the small intestine, which is J and E for ileum and duodenum. We've got secretion of pepsin happening in the stomach, and that's structure C. And the stomach has acidic conditions because pepsin, which is a enzyme, protease enzyme, breaking down protein, works best under acidic conditions. That's why stomach produces hydrochloric acid to give pepsin some good conditions for it to work in. The site of maltose digestion would be in the small intestine again, where the small intestine has a lot of enzymes that come from the pancreatic juice that contains a lot of different enzymes used to digest food. The secretion of bile happens in the liver, and bile emulsifies fats so that it's a lot easier to digest, or it's a lot easier for the lipases to access and digest. So it works by increasing the surface area of lipids to get broken down. And of course, the secretion of lipases and trypsin, which are both enzymes, happen in the pancreas in the form of pancreatic juice that enters the small intestine for digestion of food. Alright, so moving on, adaptive features are defined as inherited features of an organism that increases its fitness. This term adaptive features has come up in other papers as well, where they got you to define it. So this would literally be the definition here. Inherited features of an organism that increases its fitness. In this specific question, they're asking you what is meant by fitness. This is also a common question. It's the probability of an organism's survival and reproduction in that specified environment. So in this question here, they give you a picture of this rodent, and they say that it's a nocturnal animal that lives in desert conditions. They ask you to tell them how they are adapted, seemingly looking at the picture and things like that, how they adapted to high daytime temperatures and also little light at night. They're adapted to high temperatures just from the photo because you can see that they have very little fur, and they're also quite lean with little fat. That would reduce insulation, allowing the body to cool down faster, along with the fact that they are nocturnal, so they avoid most of the heat in the afternoon by remaining in their little burrows, or those little hole things. At night, you could suggest that they have big eyes and large ears and, you know, sensitive smell and things like that, just to compensate for the lack of vision. But, you know, you just need to use your imagination here. There are a couple of different points that you could have written to get the answers. And I think they're usually pretty lenient with these things here, as long as it's fairly logical. So this part of the question is talking about the pyramids of numbers and biomass and things like that. They first get you to complete the pyramid of biomass by looking at the table here. So, you know, you've got producers, herbivores, detritivores, and carnivores, right? What's missing on the pyramid of biomass is indeed the carnivores. So you simply just need to do that, and you can do that by noticing that producers are represented by 48 small squares. I've counted these, and that represents 48 biomass. So one little square is 10 biomass. So what that means is that you just need to draw the carnivore grid or block that uses up 4 little squares, okay, to represent 40 biomass. So it states here that the scientists observed detritivores and decided to include them with herbivores in the pyramid of biomass, and they're asking you, why do you think that happened? So, you know, it must have been that the observations that they made of these detritivores were very similar to herbivores. And so herbivores are animals that eat plants or producers. They feed at the second trophic level and are eaten by secondary consumers. So these detritivores must have shared the same characteristics. Explain why there are really more than 4 or 5 trophic levels. Okay, so this has much to do with the loss of energy at each step along the way. So approximately 90% of energy is lost at each trophic level, so little energy is basically transferred from one animal to the next in terms of the trophic level. So a lot of energy is lost, obviously, if you know 90% is a lot, from things like respiration, and the fact that when one organism eats another organism, not all parts of that particular organism can be digested or absorbed, so you're not using 100% of what you eat, basically. So, you know, those are a couple of things why there are a lot of energy losses, but ultimately what it comes down to is that there isn't enough energy to support higher trophic levels because, you know, energy drops at each level. Okay, so that's why you have a cap of 4 or 5 trophic levels per ecosystem. So this question here asks you to tell you why the pyramid of biomass might be better than the pyramid of numbers, and that's because the pyramid of numbers represents one large individual exactly the same way as one tiny individual, and that's a bit misleading because one big individual will have a lot more energy in it than multiple small individuals, so that's not a good representation of what amount of actual energy is available. So therefore the pyramid of numbers is not always pyramid shaped, whereas the pyramid of biomass will be, because it literally represents the amount of energy available. So for example, in the pyramid of numbers, if you have like one sort of, let's see if I can, sorry. Okay, here we go. So if you have one large tree, and a lot of different caterpillars eat on that tree, you can see that it's a little bit off. It's not really representative of what amount of energy is actually present in those trees. If you actually looked at the biomass though, the one big tree has a lot more biomass or energy in it than millions of little caterpillars that may be eating on it. Okay, so this is the pyramid of biomass, and it's always pyramid shaped, so it's better. The pyramid of numbers can often give you misleading results, so that's not great. So moving on, we've got this question here that asks you about the roots and things like that. So these things here is the phloem, X is the xylem, and then they get you to label that. We've got the cortex, and we've also got the epidermis and the most outer part. So they ask you why xylem is a tissue. This is simply asking you to tell them what the definition of a tissue is, which is a tissue is composed of cells with similar structures and they work together to form shared functions. That is exactly why a xylem is a tissue, because it's just that. They get you to also, and this question here, tell you about how the internal structure of leaves results in a large quantity of water being lost through transpiration, and this goes down to how familiar you are with the structure of the leaf. So basically the xylem inside vascular bundles will provide the leaf with water, and of course water is important because all cells need water. So the water gets taken up by palisade mesophyll cells and spongy mesophyll cells, and what tends to happen is the water will actually evaporate from the surface of mesophyll cells and enter the air spaces inside the spongy mesophyll. And the spongy mesophyll has air spaces mainly for air or gas exchange, when we're exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide and things like that, but also for the water vapor to enter. And as it enters those air spaces, it will actually leave the leaf through stomata, which is a gap in the underside of the leaf by guard cells that create that space. Okay, so the water vapor diffuses out through the stomata, and that's how transpiration happens, and that's how water is lost. So that's how the overall internal structure of a leaf allows that to happen. So this question here is about the flow of blood through the skin, which is apparently investigated using a flow meter. That's not really too important. It's more important to understand what's going on and the theory behind all this. First of all, in this question, they get you to label some simple stuff. So P is a sensory neuron that carries impulses from the receptors which exist in the skin all the way to the brain. And you've got some things here, and I'll just label some of these for you. But of course this is the, if I can do that. Okay, so sorry, I don't know how I did it before, but okay, so so this thing here, okay, so we'll just go step by step. This is the arteries that carry blood away from the heart, and they branch out into smaller vessels called arterioles. So the arterioles will branch off into capillaries, which is represented by the label T. So S is arterioles, and the capillaries are sort of grouped together to form venules, and the venules are combined to form veins. And so we've got these horizontal vessels that connect an arteriole directly to the venules called shunt vessels, and both shunt vessels and the arterioles have muscular walls that can contract or dilate. Okay, so we will look at that in a bit more detail later. So it says state the name of the tissue R that provides insulation. It's pretty obvious, fat or fatty tissue. Any one of those would have gotten you the marks. Here is more like a an investigative question where they give you this graph here, average blood flow as a percentage of maximum blood flow, and as the temperature rises, you get different effects. So they first tell you to describe the effect of increasing the temperature of the skin and the surface of blood flow to the skin without capsicum. So this is, they're asking you to describe this here. So when they ask you to describe a graph, this is probably the easiest way to get marks in your exam, because all you literally need to do is tell them what's going on. So you can say things like, initially the blood flow is fairly stable and consistent, up until the point where around 25 degrees Celsius things start to go up and up and up. You can state that it reaches a maximum at around 41 degrees. And it starts increasing from 25, all that sort of stuff. Simply just describe the graph and you'll get the marks. Pretty easy. Explain the mechanism that increases the blood flow through to the skin. So this is where the theory really needs to be strong for you to understand how to solve questions like this. So again, let's take it back to this diagram here. I really wish I could draw on here. I don't know how I did it. Oh, here we go. Okay, so no. Yes. No. No, it's still not working. Oh, okay. It's weird because yeah, okay, it's weird. It's blocked off here. I can't actually draw on this. Okay, so that's not a problem. So basically what happens is the blood flow comes from the arteries into the arterioles. So when the temperature rises, then the body wants to cool down, right? So what happens is the rise in temperature over here is detected by the receptors, and the impulses get carried by the neurons all the way to the brain. And what happens is the brain sends signals to the muscles in both the arterioles here, which is S, and the shunt vessels. And so from the brain all the way to the arterioles and the shunt vessels. And what it does is it causes the arterioles to dilate and the shunt vessels, or the muscles in the shunt vessels, to constrict, okay? And the reason for that is because if you are hot, you need to maximize the amount of blood flowing to the capillaries, because the closer you bring blood to the skin, more blood will radiate, or sorry, more heat from the blood will radiate out to allow the body temperature to cool down. So, therefore, the arterioles will actually dilate to allow more blood flow to the capillaries, and the shunt vessels will constrict to allow less flow from the arterioles directly to the veins, forcing the blood to take the longer path through the capillaries to allow more blood to flow through the capillaries to allow more heat to get lost. Of course, everything would be the exact opposite if it was getting too cold and the body wanted to heat up. Then they would want to minimize the amount of blood in the capillaries. So hopefully that all makes sense. So going back to the answer then, it's basically what I said just then. The stimulus gets detected by the receptors, impulse sent to the brain sends impulses to the muscles inside arterioles and shunt vessels. Through motor neurons, muscles and shunt vessels will contract, whereas arterioles will relax, and allowing maximum blood to flow into the capillaries to allow the heat to radiate out. State the difference between, okay, so this one here, you just take a look at 35 degrees and measure, the average blood flow, and, just compare the difference, and you should arrive at 46%. And also here in this question, they're trying to link this question to, diffusion and active transport. So the researchers thought that the capsicum stimulated receptors on the skin, explained the process by which the capsicum could reach these receptors. And so here you just take a look at diffusion and active transport and things like that. Okay, so diffusion, you just state that it's obviously from high to low concentration, whereas active transport, you're going against the concentration gradients and across membranes and such. So, explain the importance of regulating body temperature. This is, you could have a variety of points here that you could get to use to get the full marks. Of course, the maintenance of an optimum temperature for enzymes to work at is important so that they do not denature, because high temperatures will destroy the enzymes. Maintaining constant rates of reactions throughout the body and in terms of, normal metabolism is also quite important, along with other, valid points like avoiding damage to cell membranes, or even avoiding damage to sperm production. Remember, the testes keep the scrotum keeps the testicles outside of the body just to allow sperm production to be a bit more effective, because high temperatures will actually damage sperm production, and even the normal body temperature is too high for that, so that's why it's kept outside. So you could have used any of these points here. So moving on, the body temperature is controlled by hormones and nerves. Explain how coordination by hormones is different from coordination from nerves. This is an this is a theme that repeats throughout past papers so they're just getting you to compare hormones with nerves. So of course, hormones are chemicals that are transported in the blood, whereas nerves are electrical impulses that travels in neurons. The effect of hormones on different target organs are they're slower, but the effects are longer lasting. And each hormone may have more than one target, whereas nerves, it just goes from one end to the other and only has one sort of target effector. Okay, so make sure you know the differences between hormonal and nervous coordination, because they do ask that a lot. Moving on to this question here, seemingly about respiration. It asks you to write a balanced equation for aerobic respiration. Pretty simple stuff here. Of course, the numbers are actually meant to be written down smaller, but I couldn't actually change the font size of individual characters, so that's why it looks a little bit odd at the moment. But anyway, they give you this graph here, and it's about how the average rate of oxygen consumption is different depending on the level of exercise. And of course, as you increase the exercise level, more oxygen is required. And this graph shows you that. So the percentage increase in average rate of oxygen consumption from walking to trotting. Well, trotting is 50, walking is 20. So that's, what the percentage increase is 150%, because 50 divided by 20 times 100 is 150. So researchers calculate the oxygen depth. Okay, so whenever you look at something with oxygen depth, then they're asking about anaerobic respiration. So they found that the horses have a larger oxygen depth when they're doing, galloping rather than, walking, for example. So they're asking, so they ask, why this happens. So of course, as the amount of exercise becomes a bit more strenuous, there's an increased demand for oxygen, because the muscles require oxygen to respire in order to provide the muscles the energy required for that exercise. At some point, there may be limited supply of oxygen to the muscles, because the heart rate hasn't increased enough to provide sufficient oxygen for the muscles that desperately need oxygen to respire. So the amount of oxygen that is required by the muscles is more than what the body can give it, okay? Because the heart rate is gradually increasing, and initially it's not fast enough. So the muscles are forced to respire anaerobically in the absence of oxygen, and you get lactic acid being formed. So this is called an oxygen depth, because you need oxygen in order to remove the lactic acid, and lactic acid is toxic to the body. So in the absence of oxygen, the muscles can respire, of course. It's just that they produce lactic acid, and we need to attain extra oxygen after exercise in order to remove it. So we're in depth of oxygen, basically. All the horses are in this case. So describe how the horses would recover from an oxygen depth when they stop exercising. So have you ever noticed that when you stop exercising, your heart rate doesn't just normalize instantly? In fact, your heart rate continues to get high, continues to be high, and gradually falls off. So, after the exercise, the horses will continue to breathe at a high rate and deeply, along with the fact that the heart rate will continue to be high as well. All of this basically allows sufficient oxygen to enter the body, despite the fact that the muscles aren't exercising anymore, but more to allow the body to remove the lactic acid, because the lactic acid is broken down using the oxygen. So this question here is clearly about sexual reproduction. Simple table here, getting you to tell them where meiosis happens, which is in the ovaries, because the ovaries produce egg cells. Fertilization happens in the oviduct, which is S, and the implantation happens in the uterus lining, which is V. We've already named S, which is the oviduct, and that's the site for fertilization. And here is a diagram of a sperm cell. They tell you they ask you to write the formula for magnification, which is image divided by actual size. Apply the formula, you should get 55 microns for this particular question. Pretty simple stuff. And explain why the nuclei of the sperms will differ from those of other cells. Of course, this is a question to do with the fact that sperm is a haploid cell and contains 23 chromosomes rather than 46 of chromosomes like the rest of the cells of the body. And this is because sperm cells are produced by meiosis, okay, rather than mitosis in terms of self-division. And the main reason why meiosis halves the chromosome number is so that the chromosome number can stay the same at 46 once the sperm combines with an egg after fertilization, because otherwise, if the sperm had 46 chromosomes, you'll end up with 96 chromosomes in the zygote after fertilization, and that obviously wouldn't work. Okay, so it's mainly to keep the chromosome number the same at 46. They get you to explain the roles of each of these structures here, the flagellum, the mitochondria, and the acrosome. So the flagellum is this tail-like structure here, and basically it allows the sperm to be mobile and propels the sperm to the oviduct, which is where the fertilization happens, where it meets the egg. The mitochondria allows the sperm to respire aerobically, producing energy that is required for the movement that the flagellum gives it. The acrosome, which is in the head of the sperm, contains digestive enzymes which break the jelly coating of the egg cell, allowing it to penetrate so that the sperm nucleus can fuse with the egg nucleus in fertilization. So, lastly, explain why the sex of a child is determined by the father. Well, that's because sex is determined by whether the child has an XY or an XX. XX is a female, XY is a male. Which means that because the mother is a female, they can only have X chromosomes in their DNA, whereas sperm cells can either have X or Y because the male has both X and Y chromosomes. So depending on whether the sperm is an X or a Y chromosome, that will dictate whether the child is a male or a female. Okay, so that is the end of this video. I hope it helped, you know, overall, I don't think it was a very difficult paper, but there are certain concepts that you do need to, you know, work on, I suppose. A lot of these questions also do repeat in other papers, so it's really important that you familiarize yourself with these questions and sort of the answers and the key words that the answers are looking for. But otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers, guys.